Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to finally get around to doing a non-spoiler but in-depth review for the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I've been saying for a while now that this is one of my new all-time favorites, and I wanted to go in-depth as to why. I'm basically trying to convince you to read it if you haven't read it yet. I do recognize though that this isn't going to be the series for everyone. Obviously no book is, so I'm actually going to go about this a little differently than I typically would for a review. I'm going to start with reasons why this might not work for you, as pretty much the entire rest of the video is going to be me talking about why it's so fantastic, why it's basically perfect. Starting with, though, the potential reasons why this might not work for you. First off, it is grimdark. Not everybody likes grimdark. Not everybody's looking for that kind of cynical realism that you find in grimdark. Also, it's extremely low fantasy in that there is basically no magic in this. It pops up from time to time, but when it does, it's not really in a hard magic kind of way that we've grown accustomed to with a lot of more modern fantasy works. It just sort of happens and you just have to roll with it. It also has a lot more of a historical fiction feel, to be honest. This is in part because it's so low fantasy, but also it genuinely feels like you're reading about a time in history and you're looking at rather significant players on the board within that time. Also, with it being grimdark and what grimdark entails, because that can mean a couple different things, I don't think that Abercrombie leans into the shock value side that you sometimes find within grimdark. That said, he does describe everything, and that's not everybody's cup of tea. So what I mean by that is, one, these characters are horrible people, so you're going to get their innermost thoughts and feelings, and not everybody wants to read about people that are super cutthroat. You don't always want to follow individuals who are classist, racist, sexist, homophobic, pretty much all the bad things. You don't always want to, one, be in a world where those things are so prevalent, but two, some of the characters engage in thoughts that are very much rooted in those things. And again, not everybody is looking to read that. Sometimes you want the more triumphant, heroic types of stories. And this is not that. It's kind of the antithesis of those sorts of things, which I enjoy. I like having the stories where you get the fist bumping, yes, the triumphant, exciting, admirable heroes. But then sometimes it's nice to have the exact opposite of that, where you have a book that is showing you, why does the world suck? Oh yeah, this is why. That said, some people do not want to be reminded of reality. Some people do not want to engage in those sorts of things. On top of that, it's extremely vulgar. It's really violent. It goes into detail about all of those sorts of things. And again, that's not everybody's cup of tea. So if that doesn't sound like something you would enjoy, this might not be the trilogy for you. And the last potential con is that it is exceptionally meandering. Maybe isn't the best way to put it, but it's not like there is a set antagonist. There's not a heist that we're trying to execute. It's not going to have that direct, these are our motivations, okay, let's move forward towards this goal. And some people prefer that. So, for example, if you're somebody who loves in Mistborn that you have this plot that everybody is engaging with, that everybody wants to take part in, and then the exciting aspects of the story is how are they going to ever accomplish this, and then also will they, if they have hiccups along the way, how are they going to come back from that? Are they actually going to fail? How does this, there's more books in this series, so they can't possibly totally win, right? And those kinds of questions that you ask with stories that have more set goals, you don't really know in this. You're just following characters. You're just following bad people, or just people in a bad world. You're following people. That's really what it comes down to. You're just following people around. And because Abercrombie is so good at writing people, it works. However, for some people, they're like, I don't want to just follow characters. I want more going on. And if that's you, once again, this might not be the series for you. But all that said, it is so good. It's so good for so many reasons, and I want to jump into and go in depth with why. So if you don't know anything about the somewhat general synopsis of this, I just said we kind of follow people around, that's that. But there is one thing about it that is, I think, really prevalent and in a sense is almost like a character in and of itself, which would be the setting. You are looking at this sort of turn of the century feel. It is slightly more modern than what you typically find in fantasy, so I liked the setting was a little bit different. And you do have this industrial revolution type of setup. And you're looking at innovation, but how does that innovation in some ways push society forward? Who actually benefits from these things? And in some ways, how does it push society back? There is a quote, and I'm going to read through various different quotes throughout the entirety of this video, but this particular one I think captures that concept really well. This character is not even an actual perspective. Abercrombie does this really interesting artistic thing throughout all 3 books in the trilogy where he has chapters called The Little People, and he just kind of follows for about a page or so different characters at different moments throughout the series, these really pivotal big moments, and you kind of get to see inside the heads of everybody from the bottom to the top. And this is one of those moments, and what this character is essentially thinking in this moment captures, like I said, in my opinion, what so much of this book has, so much of the series has. It says, "We are all carried into the future always. What greets us when we arrive, that is the pressing question. When the prophet vanished, Muslin and those of his mind, the thinkers, philosophers, engineers, had hoped for a new age of reason. Instead had come an age of madness." That gives a general idea of the larger themes, but diving into the thing that Abercrombie does so well, and pretty much everybody that picks up and loves his works praises, which would be his characters. His character work is second to none. There is not really another author that can write characters that are honestly, most of them, pretty despicable, and yet you find yourself being like, well, but also, I mean, I don't want them, I kind of like them. And that's really what it comes down to. You're like, I feel bad that I like these characters, but I do, I guess, secretly, but maybe not secretly. I like them a lot. And if they're not despicable, they're stupid. And if they're not stupid, they feel pointless. They're the kind of people that you're like, why are you even here? You do nothing good. You, in your existence, makes things worse. And he has these characters. None of them are lovable. None of them inspire you. None of them are the kinds of characters that you aspire to be as you're a real human and they're fictional, but you look at them and they're role models for you. None of them are even close to those things. But yet you cannot help but kind of love these characters in a really weird way. There's no other author who I have found who has no single character that is your character. That is the character you're like, oh, I really relate to them. Oh, I feel so seen by them. They're such a wonderful person. None. He doesn't have any of those characters in his books. And yet you cannot help but be like, but I kind of like them, even though they're horrible. And I have never really found not only an author who can do that, but who can make me love the series with the absence of that. Because I, as an extremely character-driven reader, I want to like the characters, or I at least want to like some of them. And in this series, I don't even know if it's right to say well, there's one character that I hated, unlike any character I feel I've ever hated. But I also don't know if I can say like, oh, I loved them. I don't know. It's just like, it's indescribable the way he makes you so invested in them, and the way he can have them so clearly show their true color, so clearly indicate to you the kinds of people they are, to where you're like, man, what a horrible person. I feel like something bad needs to happen to them. And then something bad happens to them, you're like, oh, well, I didn't mean for that to happen. I didn't, that's not what I was wishing for. And he is so brilliant, not just in showing you these characters and making you have all these conflicted feelings about them, but in showing those horrible moments, you actually see what true violence actually looks like. You see how much, even when you despise characters, when they actually go through horrific things, you feel sick. You do not want more of that to occur. Even though in some ways you tell yourself maybe they deserved it, but on the flip side, you really question, oh no, I don't think they deserved that. What's really frustrating is that you know that these people that you are following, a lot of them have a lot of power. A lot of them hold a lot of sway over what happens. And they're so bad at what they do, or they're exceptional at what they do, and what they happen to do well is gaining whatever they want out of any given situation, no matter the repercussions and the consequences on other people. But you see for yourself, okay, I would prefer if we had these characters out of power. I am seeing what corruption looks like, so I'd prefer things change. And one of Abercrombie's big themes is that nothing really changes, or, okay, so you thought you wanted this? Here, I'll give it to you. And you're like, dang it, it's not better though. And so another really prominent theme is how the corrupt stay in power, how the corrupt replace those before them who were also corrupt, so thus it's always someone corrupt in power, and then also as an extension of that, how the poor always stay poor, how even when you have this innovation, even when society is changing at large, there are always going to be those people that are caught at the bottom, and there are always going to be people that profit off of the suffering of others. And I think, once again, a really great example of this is shown to us in a rare moment where an Abercrombie character actually wants to have a positive impact on the world, and they want to use their power for good, and everything around them is turning out to be an obstacle. And everybody also almost looks down at this person for being this way, looks at them as naive, and you have somebody tell them, "We are not here to set right all the world's wrongs. We're here to ensure that we benefit from them." And that in and of itself, I think, could also be a good quote to pull for, here are the grand themes of this trilogy. In some ways, I think the first quote is more so showing you the setting, and how the setting, like I said, is kind of like a character and how it pushes things forward. But this sort of sets the scene for the tone of the story. This tells you what the true nature is of mankind, why things don't change. I think that quote right there is the fact that there are always going to be those people, usually not in such an upfront way, but sometimes in an upfront way, you're going to have those people that all they want is to gain the most they can from any given situation. I was touching on earlier that despite the fact that you see these horrible people, you find yourself not really wanting them to actually go through atrocities once you're shown atrocities on page. Part of what makes these characters in these situations so despicable is their greed and their selfishness. And when they experience atrocities, something that you hope, that you can't help but hope, kind of in our own world, but within the context of this story as well, is that when they go through something traumatic, your desire for them is for them to see that, to learn, and for their empathy to grow and expand. And rather than that happening time and time and time again, you are seeing how their trauma response is to go inward and to instead look at how I can look after me and mine. That's all I care about. I am protecting myself. Nobody else is protecting me. I have seen the ways of the world, and the ways of the world are cruel. They couldn't care less who you are, how much status you have, how much wealth or power you have, no matter how much it is. When people are dying, people are dying. So I'm going to do whatever I have to do. And it's aggravating and so realistic, because how often do we see terrible things in the world and we think, does everybody else not see what I'm seeing? I know other people are seeing what I'm seeing. If we're all collectively recognizing that something bad is happening, then why does it keep happening? And it's because of things that you're shown in this story. Because when people do experience these things firsthand, nobody is able to save them. Nobody is going to rescue them so often. Obviously, there are hopeful moments in reality, but not always. Sometimes the world is bleak. Sometimes it is dark. And so people start to want to only ever look after themselves. And this is such a devastating thing to explore. And he explores it in a way that is both realistic, but also, given the nature of his writing, he is very funny. So he makes it more palatable for you. And I'll get more to the humor in a little bit, because there is a lot that's really funny in this series. But another aspect that's tied into this idea of how people respond to trauma, when people actually try to do the right thing, when people try to enact change, often that comes at the expense of someone's life or groups of people dying. And so I think there's a character that really accurately summarizes that what it takes to actually have change, and then also if it's even worth it, is stated so well when there's a discussion that is occurring. And to give some context, people are talking about starting the good fight, so that something can finally happen. And a character responds and says, "Trouble with the good fight, I find, once the fight starts, the good stops." The idea being that if you are finally pushed so far that you're willing to do something, even if you have certain principles, even if there are lines that you won't cross, when you rally people to your cause, not everybody abides by your principles, and by principles that I think a lot of us as readers would want everybody to abide by. It's chaos. People, and again, this, if you don't know, this series is called The Age of Madness. So when you have these uprisings, they end up going out of control. Even if the initiative was good, even if some people within had good intentions, what ends up happening as a result of actually taking action and starting that good fight is it's no longer good. It's so perfectly stated. It's so frustrating. Like I said, it's so frustrating how good this is, in a good way, obviously. But you're just like, gosh, darn it. It's perfect. It's perfect. Obviously, violence is something that is utilized within the story to show these themes, but you also see what I described earlier in why this series might not be for everybody, but you see on page and throughout the series things that keep society from progressing, the things that make society crumble. You have sexism, racism, nepotism, xenophobia, homophobia. You have all of those things within this. And I'll touch on an example with sexism, as I find when he writes it, he kind of has a gift for showing these things in a way where you feel, if you've experienced these things, like, oh, he gets it. And he shows it in a way where you watch people engage in these things and you get frustrated at them, but he kind of is writing it in a way where even though he is not breaking the fourth wall and talking to you, you still feel like he's right there with you and being like, look at all these idiots. Look at how dumb they are. And I think a perfect example is there is a moment where they're talking about this woman who is referred to as the judge. And she is somebody who has a lot of influence over the masses. She also is a thorn in the side, to put it mildly, for the individuals who are currently up at the top. And so they're having a meeting. All of these men are coming together to have a discussion on the current situation. And they reference this woman and they say, lunatics, this woman judge. And in the narration it says, shudders of distaste about the table at the notion of such a thing as a woman, or at the notion of this particular one. It was hard to say. I, first off, love the snark. I love his snarkiness throughout his series. I love the sarcasm and the dry humor. It's so great. And if you don't know, I'm sure you do, but the narrator for these audiobooks is so good, and he brings these to life pretty much unlike any narrator. But even just reading those scenes, you don't have to have the narrator in case you're not really an audiobook listener. Just reading, it's just funny. He's funny, and he captures these things in a way, like I said, where he shows them. It's like he's not hiding the truth that this is how often reality is. He's putting it right there in front of you, but then he's also like, look how dumb they are. And I love it. I absolutely love that he does that. It's not always executed quite in that fashion. Obviously, in that example, I was showing characters behaving stupidly, to be honest. And in another example, I think it juxtaposes that really, really well, where you're actually looking at a character who is a woman and you're kind of recognizing how she is feeling with her place in society versus her father's place and what it was like for him versus what it's like for her. And in this moment, it says, her father had earned everyone's respect over years. She didn't have years, and sometimes it seemed folks would indulge a man's mistakes while they held a woman's against her. Again, you have the snarky, look how stupid this person is, but then you have that really deep, almost gutting, tragic statement. It's there, it's not pages and pages long. It's brief, but it packs an enormous punch. And then also, just because I mentioned that nepotism is somewhat of a thing in this, I wanted to read a line that is, once again, showcasing that Abercrombie is very, very funny. They're currently, in the narration, referencing a character who his father had ruled, now he's ruling. I'm not going to say the character's name, but it says he was born with a silver spoon so far up his butt you could see the end when he yawned. Not only is this funny, and not only does it describe how people would look at somebody who was just born with privilege, but also it's creative. I will give what are my personal quote-unquote criticisms. I mentioned at the beginning of the video things that might not work for other people, and those weren't really obviously things that were negatives for me. I do want to touch on what are somewhat maybe negatives for me, but before we get into that, the last thing I'll say is that there are some amazing twists and turns in this series on top of all the other stuff that's great, and the foreshadowing. I cannot describe what the foreshadowing is like, because if I do, it will ruin it. And it's so frustrating that I can't tell you if you don't know, because I just want I just want to be able to show you how good it is, but that would lessen the impact. But it's the kind of foreshadowing that you don't know it's foreshadowing until you get to what has been foreshadowed, and then you're like, oh, he told me from the start, and it's aggravating. And it's great. It's great. Now, the negatives for me, and there's not many, and they're really not a big deal, obviously, because I've spent how long now gushing about this series? But one of the things is I definitely find that the idea of there being the little people, this is kind of what I started the review with. There being these chapters where he dives into the perspectives of any given person at any given monumental event. And so you get to see this full range of feelings and experiences. While I loved this most of the time that he did this, because he does do this throughout the trilogy, there were a couple of times I don't know that I needed it. And so I think maybe it was utilized a couple too many times. And that's not a big deal whatsoever. It's just that I always appreciate an artistic choice. I think that his decision to engage in this one was a great decision. I just think maybe it happened a couple times more than I would have liked. And then the last thing is that his action scenes are great. They're very well written, but I think sometimes they're a little too long. The reason I think this is because Abercrombie has a way of presenting to you everything you want and then taking it all away. And as a result, when he writes action scenes, you can't help but be like, I feel like nothing that happens during this action scene is really where the excitement is. I feel like there's this obvious excitement associated with action, but he's going to either take everything away from me, or he's going to make it seem like he's taking everything away from me during the action, and then as soon as it's over, he's actually going to give me something good. But he's always going to do the interesting thing, like the truly interesting thing, right at the very next moment, pretty much, or the very, very end of it. And as a result, I kind of just feel like I'm waiting for the action to finish so that I can get to whatever it is he's going to do to me. You know, whatever mean thing he's going to execute. You know, it's just, you're just like, I know you're gonna, I know even if it seems like they win, they don't somehow. I just know because you're cruel in your writing. So the action scenes sometimes were a tiny bit too long. And this is a thing I would say was true of how I felt about First Law. There's a couple times, there's actually not that many action scenes, if you don't know. But when they occur, there was a couple times in First Law I felt similarly. But in this trilogy, I think it was, he's just crafted the story so perfectly that you just can't help but want to get to whatever next thing is going to happen. I want to really quick end this video on a recommendation. It's not in any way the book I'm going to mention written the same. It's not even the same genre. But if you like the idea of nothing really changes and you appreciate authors that are willing to show the truth of that, I think the historical fiction story A Crane Among Wolves is quite good at depicting that. The author did a lot of research about Joseon, where you're looking at somebody who was ruling and they were despised, and then what they actually did with that power, which was horrible. The author showed that. It's a more intimate, you're only looking at really two people within this greater plot and this historical time, and it's kind of a murder mystery as well. Again, it's not really similar to First Law in its plot, but that idea that nothing really changes, I think the author accomplished that very well. And if you like that theme and you like historical fiction, which First Law kind of feels like in a lot of ways, you might like that. It'd also be a new change of pace and a different setting than what you get in First Law, but with similar themes. But anyway, that's it for my gush session of the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I absolutely love this. I'm sad I didn't get around to it sooner. I'm upset that I'm probably not going to find anything as good as this for years. It always takes years. But it's worth it. It's so good. I absolutely love it. If you've read it and you want to mention any spoilers, just make sure to write spoilers in your comment and then enter a bunch of times so that nobody who comes to this video is spoiled. If you haven't read this series and you're interested in checking it out, I'll have it linked in the description bar down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.